In early 1945, the Baltic coast between the Vistula and the Oder became a secondary map sector in many high-level discussions, but on the ground, it contained the remnants of major German formations and the approach routes to Berlin from the north after the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. Red Army spearheads advanced roughly 400 kilometers in a few weeks, taking Warsaw on the 17th of January and reaching bridgeheads over the Oder by the end of the month. In the process, they bypassed large German groupings in East Prussia and Pomerania. These German forces, reorganized under Army Group Vistula, still held a belt of territory stretching from the lower Vistula to the Oder estuary. For the Soviet High Command, this created a mixed picture. On one hand, the First Belarusian Front under Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Konev stood within artillery range of Berlin. On the other, Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front faced German units that could strike into the flanks of any renewed drive on the German capital. Intelligence estimates in February 1945 indicated that, in East Pomerania and West Prussia, German commands could still field several 100,000 personnel, including elements of the Second Army, 11th Army, and ad hoc corps formed from training units, Volkssturm contingents, and naval personnel. These estimates varied, but they agreed that the German presence was sufficient to threaten Soviet communications to the Vistula and the lower Oder. German leadership had its own set of calculations. Hitler and the OKW still regarded the Baltic coast as a zone that had to be held to protect ports such as Danzig, Gdynia, and Kolberg, which were essential for evacuating civilians and military personnel from East Prussia and the collapsing front further east. Army Group Vistula, formally created in late January 1945, received the task of stabilizing the line between the Baltic and the Oder with a mix of depleted divisions and newly formed units. German situation reports stressed the need to keep open sea routes for the withdrawal of refugees and the supply of isolated garrisons, even as fuel stocks dwindled and the transport system came under air attack. Within the Soviet Union, public sentiment in February 1945 was shaped by expectations of imminent victory. Press coverage highlighted the entry into German territory and the approach to Berlin, but it offered limited detail on the complex operational situation in Pomerania. The emphasis remained on symbolic objectives, such as the German capital, and on revenge for years of occupation, rather than on the coastal provinces and their mixed German, Polish, and Kashubian populations. At the same time, Soviet logistical staffs had to confront the reality that the rapid advance from the Vistula had stretched supply lines across destroyed bridges, rail bottlenecks, and winter roads. In Germany, propaganda after the January defeats sought to present Pomerania and the lower Oder as defensive bastions that could shield Berlin while new reserves were organized. Radio broadcasts and newspapers insisted that the Baltic ports remained in German hands, and that the presence of Army Group Vistula meant a renewed defense of the eastern rampart. However, refugee columns from East Prussia and West Prussia, combined with reports from returning wounded, conveyed a different picture to the civilian population. An ongoing retreat, mounting losses, and the steady approach of Soviet forces to the Baltic. Allied governments in London and Washington followed developments on the Eastern Front through intelligence summaries and liaison missions, but for them, East Pomerania appeared as one sector within a larger pattern of Soviet advances. Western planners were more focused on their own crossing of the Rhine and on political questions such as zones of occupation and post-war borders. The tempo of events meant that the East Pomeranian sector, although important in operational terms, did not yet attract sustained attention in public statements or communiques. Thus, on the eve of the East Pomeranian offensive in February 1945, the region combined several layers of significance. For Soviet command, it was a flank problem that had to be solved before any decisive assault on Berlin. For German command, it was a corridor for evacuation and a barrier that might delay the war's outcome. For civilians, it was both a homeland and a transit zone, crowded with troops and refugees. Against this background, the coming operation would involve several fronts, hundreds of thousands of personnel, and casualty figures comparable to better-known campaigns. Yet it would later receive far less attention in official narratives and public memory. In February 1945, the opening of the East Pomeranian operation did not begin with a single artillery barrage, but with a series of command decisions that reoriented entire fronts. During the first week of the month, the Soviet Supreme Command ordered 2nd Belarusian Front to shift its axis from East Prussia toward Pomerania, with the explicit task of eliminating the German grouping between the lower Vistula and the Oder. This meant halting a direct advance on central Germany and redeploying armies, tank corps, and artillery across snow-covered roads and congested rail lines. Rokossovsky's headquarters began to plan an offensive from bridgeheads along the lower Vistula and from positions southeast of Danzig, combining ground attacks with pressure from the Baltic Fleet along the coast. On the German side, Army Group Vistula was still in the process of formation. Heinrich Himmler held nominal command, but operational control in East Pomerania rested largely with Colonel General Walter Weiss and the staff of the Second Army, along with officers of the newly created headquarters and surviving elements of 3rd Panzer Army. Their situation maps showed Soviet forces on multiple sides: East Prussia to the east, the Vistula line to the south, and Soviet bridgeheads approaching the Oder. Yet Hitler's directives limited the freedom to withdraw. Orders emphasized holding Danzig, Gdynia, and the Vistula crossings, maintaining evacuation routes, and defending designated fortresses such as Graudenz and Marienburg. The opening movements of the campaign were therefore as much about positioning as about combat. Soviet armies of the 2nd Belarusian Front, including the 49th, 65th, and 70th Armies and the 19th Army, shifted towards starting lines facing key road and rail junctions at Neustetten, Schneidermühl, and along the Pomeranian Wall fortification belt. Tank and cavalry formations were earmarked for later exploitation. 3rd Guards Tank Corps and 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps prepared to operate in the forested lake region where road networks were limited and thawing conditions could turn fields and tracks into mud. For German units in East Pomerania, the first phase of the offensive appeared as a tightening ring. Infantry divisions reduced to a few thousand combat personnel. Volkssturm battalions, naval infantry, and SS units received orders to hold sectors of the Pomeranian Wall and delay any Soviet advance toward the coast. Command posts were often established in small towns that still functioned as hubs for refugee columns trying to reach ports. On the Baltic, local commanders had to divide limited transport and fuel between their own formations and the civilian evacuation effort. Civilians experienced the opening of the offensive in different ways along the front. In rural areas south of the Baltic coast, residents saw increased military traffic and heard distant artillery as Soviet preparation fires began against German outposts. In Danzig and Gdynia, the priority remained loading ships for Operation Hannibal, the mass evacuation across the Baltic. Even as air raids intensified and reports arrived of Soviet forces approaching from the south and East Polish and Kashubian inhabitants of the countryside, already subjected to German occupation policies, now anticipated a new change of authority as Soviet and later Polish units moved into the region. Within Soviet field armies, the opening of the operation was marked by concentrated artillery registration and forward reconnaissance. Reconnaissance groups probed German positions along the Pomeranian Wall, identifying strong points, minefields, and the locations of anti-tank guns. Staff officers compiled these reports with aerial photographs and interrogations of prisoners captured in local engagements. The intention was to achieve local superiority in manpower and guns on selected sectors before committing major forces, rather than advancing on an extended front. At the same time, German intelligence services assessed Soviet intentions from intercepted radio traffic, prisoner statements, and aerial observation. By mid-February, staff officers correctly concluded that the Red Army would try to clear Pomerania before any renewed assault on Berlin. Requests from the Second Army to withdraw to shorter lines closer to the Oder, which would have sacrificed territory but conserved forces, were passed to higher headquarters. These requests conflicted with directives to hold every major town on the Vistula and the coast as fortress areas. Thus, before the first large-scale breakthroughs, the East Pomeranian offensive began as a contest of deployments, command arrangements, and divergent priorities. Soviet headquarters sought to concentrate almost 1 million personnel under Second Belarusian Front and attached formations for a focused drive to the Baltic German leadership, attempted to retain control of ports and evacuation corridors while resisting pressure along a front that was already stretched. The choices made in this early phase shaped the subsequent tempo of the campaign and the pattern of encirclements and urban battles that would follow in the following weeks. For the Soviet leadership, the East Pomeranian operation formed part of a wider sequence of late-war offensives rather than a separate campaign. Stavka directives in February 1945 assigned Second Belarusian Front the task of destroying the main forces of German Second Army, seizing Danzig and Gdynia, and reaching the lower Oder on a broad front. The goal was to eliminate any possibility of a German counterstroke against the flanks of First Belarusian Front before the main assault on Berlin. Operational plans envisaged a rapid advance to the Baltic in two main stages. First, cutting the German front into isolated groupings around key towns and fortresses. Second, reducing these pockets with combined infantry, armour, and heavy artillery. Rokossovsky's staff translated these directives into concrete force ratios. On selected breakthrough sectors, Soviet planners aimed for local superiority that often exceeded 3-1 in infantry and guns, using several combined arms armies, tank corps with a few hundred medium tanks and self-propelled guns, and dense artillery groupings. Engineer units were allocated to breach the Pomeranian Wall and to restore roads and bridges in the lake region. Logistic plans relied on repairing rail lines from the Vistula, establishing supply depots close to the front, and using motor transport columns to move ammunition and fuel along winter roads that were vulnerable to thaw and congestion. Doctrinally, the operation followed patterns developed since 1943. Powerful artillery preparations, concentrated tank thrusts to operational depth, and encirclement of major strongpoints rather than frontal assaults wherever possible. However, planners also had to account for the specific terrain of Pomerania, with forests, frozen fields, and chains of lakes that channeled movement along limited road axes. This increased the risk of bottlenecks, counterattacks against exposed flanks, and delays in bringing forward heavy equipment. Staff calculations attempted to schedule successive blows so that one army's advance would open routes for another, maintaining continuous pressure despite logistic strains. German planning proceeded from a different starting point. Army Group Vistula lacked the initiative and freedom of maneuver needed for a large offensive. Its main objectives were to delay the Soviet advance, retain control of the ports, and Vistula crossings long enough to continue evacuations, and if possible stabilize a line that would shield Berlin's northern approaches. Operational orders to Second Army and neighbouring commands emphasized holding fortress cities such as Graudenz, Schneidermühl, Kolberg, and Danzig as nodal points, each to be defended with reinforced garrisons, field fortifications, and whatever artillery could be assembled from army and navy stocks. German staff work focused on arranging scarce mobile reserves for counterattacks against Soviet penetrations. Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions reduced in strength, along with battle groups formed from training schools, were planned as fire brigade units to strike advancing Soviet columns near road junctions and river crossings. However, shortages of fuel, serviceable vehicles, and radio equipment limited the ability to shift these reserves quickly. The need to escort refugee columns and maintain order in rear areas further constrained operational choices, as did repeated high-level prohibitions against any large-scale withdrawal without explicit permission. Propaganda and political considerations influenced planning on both sides. Soviet public statements linked the coming offensive not only to the military destruction of German forces, but also to opening access to the Baltic for a future Polish state. This helped justify the diversion of significant resources away from a direct march on Berlin. In Germany, regime leaders portrayed the defense of Pomerania as part of a wider struggle for the remaining eastern provinces, but internal documents also stressed the importance of continuing evacuations by sea from Danzig, Gdynia, and nearby ports. The requirement to protect these operations sometimes overrode purely military considerations about the most defensible lines. Miscalculations emerged in these planning phases. Soviet staffs, encouraged by the success of the Vistula-Oder advance, expected that German formations in Pomerania would be quickly broken, and that resistance would resemble previous retreats from Belarus and Ukraine. This assumption influenced estimates of the duration and cost of the operation. German plans, in turn, often assumed that isolated strongpoints could hold out for extended periods, and that limited counterattacks might regain lost localities, despite the clear disparity in artillery, air support, and reserves. Both sides entered the campaign with plans that combined realistic assessments of terrain and resources with expectations that would be revised as fighting intensified and casualties mounted. The first phase of the offensive began in mid-February 1945, with concentrated blows against the Pomeranian Wall and the fortified towns covering road and rail lines. On 10th February, formations of 2nd Belarusian Front opened large-scale attacks from bridgeheads on the lower Vistula and from positions east of Schneidermühl and Deutsche Krone artillery groups, in some sectors with more than 150 guns and mortars per kilometre of front, fired timed barrages against German strongpoints, communication trenches, and suspected reserves. Soviet infantry from the 49th and 70th Armies moved forward behind rolling barrages, while engineer units cleared minefields and prepared passages through wire and anti-tank obstacles. German defenders along the Pomeranian Wall consisted of a mix of regular infantry divisions, fortress units, and Volkssturm companies reinforced with artillery and anti-tank guns. Many positions had concrete bunkers and trench systems dating from pre-war and early war construction, improved during the winter with log shelters and additional firing points. On several sectors, Soviet attacking regiments encountered machine gun fire and localized counterattacks that slowed their progress and inflicted casualties. Reports from Soviet battalion commanders described the need to take individual bunkers one by one with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-range fire, rather than crossing the defensive belt in a single advance. Despite this resistance, initial breakthroughs emerged where Soviet staffs had massed artillery and armour. South of Neustetten, elements of 19th Army and 3rd Guards Tank Corps broke through secondary lines and reached open terrain beyond the main belt of fortifications. Tank brigades equipped with T-34 medium tanks and self-propelled guns drove toward road junctions, splitting German frontline units from their rear areas. In response, German commands committed mobile reserves, including Panzer and Panzer Grenadier formations, fighting at reduced strength. Local counterattacks in the Schneidermühl sector temporarily halted some Soviet spearheads and restored shortened lines, but they consumed fuel and further depleted tank and infantry numbers. In urban centres designated as fortresses, the opening engagements took a different form. At Schneidermühl, a transport and rail hub, the garrison combined army units, police, and naval personnel. As Soviet forces approached, German engineers blew bridges and prepared positions within industrial districts and residential blocks. Artillery duels developed between Soviet batteries on the outskirts and German guns sighted in church towers, factories, and railway yards. Civilians sheltered in cellars or joined refugee columns heading north and west, moving along roads already congested with military transport. Territorial shifts became visible within days. Soviet maps recorded advances of 10 to 20 kilometers on some axes, with breaches in the Pomeranian wall widening. As additional divisions passed through the initial gaps, German situation reports noted the need to reorient defensive lines toward newly threatened directions, particularly where Soviet units turned north toward the Baltic coast rather than continuing straight west. This created the first signs of encirclement risk for German formations still holding positions along the Vistula and in eastern Pomerania. Morale evolved differently on each side. Soviet troops, many of whom had advanced from the Vistula in January, initially expected another rapid pursuit. The persistence of German resistance in fortresses and along the Pomeranian wall showed that the campaign would require sustained fighting. At the same time, visible progress toward key towns and the capture of supply dumps, prisoners, and equipment reinforced confidence that the German defense could not hold indefinitely. German soldiers and officers, confronted with Soviet artillery superiority and increasing air attacks, reported fatigue and pessimism in some sectors, yet local determination remained high in strongpoints where retreat was forbidden and evacuation routes still functioned. For civilians in the path of the first engagements, the offensive meant a rapid transition from rear area to front line. Villages that had served as staging points for columns of refugees became contested ground, with artillery shells falling near roads lined with carts and vehicles. Polish forced labourers and prisoners encountered Soviet reconnaissance units in the early days of the advance, sometimes before organised administration could be established. The initial clashes thus combined methodical assaults on fixed defences, attempts at mobile counterattack, and the first large-scale dislocation of the remaining population of East Pomerania, setting the pattern for the deeper operations that followed. As February 1945 drew to a close, the East Pomeranian fighting expanded from localized breakthroughs into a continuous front-wide offensive that imposed heavy strains on both sides. On 24 February, the main phase of the operation formally began, with Rokossovsky committing fresh formations of 19th Army to drive west toward Köslin and the Baltic, while neighbouring armies pressed against Graudenz, Deutschkrone, and Neustädten. Within days, Soviet infantry and armour were engaged along a line stretching from the lower Vistula to the Lake District north of Schneidermühl, turning what had been sectoral assaults into a coordinated push. German headquarters responded by concentrating what remained of their mobile forces. 7th Panzer Corps, including the remnants of 7th Panzer Division and other armoured elements, assembled near Rummelsburg to counter the thrust of 19th Army. Additional battle groups drawn from training units and replacement depots were directed toward threatened junctions. These formations, often numbering a few thousand combat personnel with limited numbers of tanks and self-propelled guns, were expected to halt or at least slow Soviet tank corps that could field several hundred vehicles across the front. Fuel shortages meant that many German units had to choose between movement and prolonged engagement. Staff reports noted instances where tanks were held in reserve simply to preserve enough fuel for a later withdrawal. As Soviet spearheads widened their penetrations, the crisis deepened for German Second Army. The fall of Neustädten on 27 February and Soviet advances toward Köslin on 2nd March cut key east-west communications. By early March, Second Army's eastern components were largely isolated from the rest of Army Group Vistula. Commands that had been tied to fortress cities now found their rear areas threatened by Soviet units approaching from unexpected directions. The need to maintain control of Danzig and Gdynia for maritime evacuation forced German planners to accept growing gaps elsewhere, producing an increasingly fragmented front. For Soviet formations, the escalation brought visible gains, but also rising costs. The concentration of Second Belarusian Front at nearly 1 million personnel and large artillery groupings allowed successive breakthroughs, yet the terrain and weather limited exploitation. Forests and lakes channeled movement along a few road axes, turning them into congested corridors, vulnerable to counterattacks and airstrikes. Thaw conditions began to affect secondary roads and fields, slowing resupply and recovery of damaged equipment. Front-level summaries later recorded overall casualties for the operation exceeding 230,000 personnel, including more than 55,000 killed or missing, indicating that by the end of the first 2 weeks of March, losses already numbered in the tens of thousands on the Soviet side alone. Civilians experienced the escalation as a continuous movement of people and material through a shrinking space. In East Pomerania and the Danzig West Prussia region, hundreds of thousands of refugees from East Prussia, West Prussia, and the Lower Vistula had already been moving toward the Baltic ports as Soviet offensives advanced from the east. The widening Soviet offensive now intersected with these routes. Columns of carts, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons shared roads with retreating German units and supply convoys. In towns such as Rummelsburg, Stolp, and Lauenburg, changes in control sometimes occurred within days, as German rearguards withdrew and Soviet units entered, followed by administrative organs and, in some sectors, Polish units tasked with establishing new authorities. Air power intensified the crisis. Soviet air armies increased sorties against rail nodes, bridges, and port facilities, aiming to disrupt German movements and the evacuation effort. German aircraft, operating from increasingly distant bases, concentrated on striking Soviet columns at road choke points and providing limited cover to shipping engaged in Operation Hannibal, the maritime evacuation across the Baltic that by March had transported hundreds of thousands of civilians and troops from ports such as Gartenhafen and Danzig. The dual requirement to shield the coastal shipping lanes and support ground operations stretched the Luftwaffe's remaining resources. Political and command tensions became more pronounced as the operation expanded. Within the Soviet camp, some generals of First Belarusian Front argued that resources devoted to Pomerania delayed the final assault on Berlin. The decision to clear Pomerania first reflected Stalin's preference for securing the northern flank and for occupying territories that would form part of post-war Poland. In the German camp, disagreements emerged over whether to conduct orderly withdrawals from exposed positions or to hold fortresses at all costs. On March 9th, Colonel General Walter Weiss was replaced by Dietrich von Sauken as commander of Second Army, a change that reflected dissatisfaction with the handling of the crisis, but did not alter the basic constraints of limited forces and fixed political directives. Internationally, the escalation in Pomerania coincided with preparations for major offensives on other fronts. Western Allied planners followed reports of the Soviet advance, but devoted more attention to the impending Rhine crossings and to political negotiations about occupation zones. Within Germany and the Soviet Union, official media acknowledged the fighting in Pomerania, yet continued to emphasize larger symbols. Berlin for Soviet audiences, and the eastern provinces, and access to the sea for German listeners. As a result, even during the operation itself, the scale of the crisis in East Pomerania risked being overshadowed by attention to other sectors, despite the concentration of large forces and rapidly rising casualty figures on both sides. The peak of the East Pomeranian campaign came in early to mid-March 1945, when Second Belarusian Front drove to the Baltic and turned the remaining German positions into isolated coastal pockets. By the first week of March, Soviet spearheads from 19th Army and 3rd Guards Tank Corps had reached the sea near Köslin, cutting 2nd Army into separate eastern and western groupings. This contact with the Baltic fulfilled one of Stavka's initial objectives and created the conditions for encircling German forces defending Danzig, Gdynia, and the coastal corridor to Kolberg. Rokossovsky now had to balance two tasks: completing the reduction of German forces inland and turning north and west to clear the coast. Orders assigned 1st Guards Tank Corps, 3rd Guards Tank Corps, and several rifle armies to exploit along the coastal strip, while other armies pressed west toward the Oder or mopped up encircled units around towns such as Rummelsburg and Lauenburg. The density of Soviet artillery and armour increased in narrow corridors leading to port cities, where streets, embankments and harbour installations could be brought under direct fire. For German Second Army and the northern elements of Army Group Vistula, this period represented the height of the crisis. After the loss of Köslin and the Soviet advance to the sea, the remaining land connection between Danzig-Gdynia and the rest of Germany narrowed to a strip of territory under constant attack. Command changes reflected the severity of the situation. In late March, General Oberst Gotthard Heinrici replaced Himmler as commander of Army Group Vistula, bringing an experienced field officer into a role previously occupied by a political leader. At the army level, von Sauken attempted to organize an orderly withdrawal into the Danzig-Gdynia bridgehead. But permissions for retreat had to be negotiated with higher headquarters that still ordered fortress cities to be held. Urban fighting in this phase reached its greatest intensity in Kolberg, Danzig and Gdynia. Kolberg, declared a fortress, became the scene of street-by-street combat between Soviet and Polish units on one side and a German garrison composed of army, navy, and Volkssturm elements on the other. Coastal batteries, naval guns, and field artillery were used against targets inside and outside the town. Evacuation by sea continued under fire, with German warships and civilian vessels loading wounded, and civilians, while Soviet artillery and aircraft tried to interdict the harbour approaches. The town finally fell in mid-March after more than a week of continuous combat. In Danzig and Gdynia, the pattern was similar on a larger scale. Soviet armies tightened the ring from south and east, taking suburbs, industrial zones, and surrounding villages. In succession, German defenders used port facilities, shipyards, and elevated terrain for overlapping fields of fire. Shipyards became fortified sectors, with cranes, hulls under construction, and warehouses turned into firing positions. Naval personnel operated heavy guns and assisted in organizing local counterattacks. Soviet infantry advanced behind concentrated artillery barrages, while engineers cleared rubble, mines, and barricades to keep routes open for tanks and self-propelled guns. Civilian suffering during this peak phase was shaped by the combination of urban combat and mass evacuation. In Danzig and Gdynia, hundreds of thousands of civilians, wounded soldiers, and administrative personnel moved through streets that were simultaneously under bombardment and serving as access routes to the docks. Air raids and artillery fire damaged residential districts and harbour infrastructure, forcing repeated changes in embarkation points. In Kolberg and along the coast, local inhabitants and refugees who could not be evacuated experienced shortages of food, medical supplies, and shelter as the fighting destroyed housing and public buildings. On the Soviet side, medical and logistics services faced their most intense workload of the operation. Field hospitals near the front received a continuous flow of wounded from infantry and tank units engaged in assaults on fortified positions. The need to clear rubble, repair roads, and maintain ammunition supply into devastated urban areas slowed the tempo of operations and required extensive use of pioneer battalions and labour units. Reports from front headquarters recorded high ammunition expenditure, particularly in artillery and heavy mortars, used to suppress German positions in built-up areas. The decision-making of higher commands during this peak reflected both operational and political considerations. Rokossovsky coordinated with Zhukov's First Belarusian Front to ensure that the East Pomeranian fighting did not prevent preparations for the Berlin operation, but he also received repeated instructions to accelerate the capture of Danzig and Gdynia because of their significance for post-war borders and access to the sea German leaders. While increasingly aware that the overall military situation was irretrievable, insisted on defending the coastal cities long enough to continue evacuation by sea. This produced a peak phase in which tactical decisions in individual streets and harbour basins were closely linked to strategic goals: securing or denying Baltic ports, completing or blocking refugee movements, and shaping the last weeks before the final offensive on Berlin. Resistance and adaptation in East Pomerania took multiple forms, from improvised defences at village level to changes in front-wide operational methods. After early breakthroughs, German commands no longer aimed to restore a continuous line, but to organise local resistance centres and mobile groups that could delay Soviet progress divisions, reduced to a fraction of their authorised strength, were reorganised into Kampfgruppen built around a few remaining artillery batteries, assault gun platoons, and experienced infantry companies. In forested sectors, these groups used ambushes along narrow roads, demolishing bridges and firing on columns at close range before withdrawing to new positions. Soviet formations adjusted to these tactics by changing the composition of their forward detachments. Instead of sending tank brigades ahead on roads with limited infantry, commanders increasingly attached sappers, machine gun platoons, and anti-tank guns to lead reconnaissance units. Where previous operations had emphasized deep penetration, in Pomerania, many advances proceeded as a series of stepwise attacks on successive strongpoints. Front headquarters issued instructions to strengthen flank security, allocate more artillery to direct support of infantry, and maintain closer liaison between tank units and rifle divisions in wooded and urban terrain. In coastal and urban sectors, German resistance relied heavily on the adaptability of naval and air force personnel used as ground troops. Sailors accustomed to shipboard service learned to man field guns and anti-aircraft weapons in improvised positions among port installations. Air Force ground crews assisted in constructing barricades and clearing rubble to maintain supply routes within besieged cities. The ability to improvise new defensive lines within damaged industrial districts allowed garrisons in Kolberg, Danzig, and Gdynia to prolong resistance despite shortages of armour and heavy equipment. Soviet and Polish units also modified their methods in response to urban conditions. Assault groups combining submachine gunners, sappers with explosives, flamethrower teams, and direct fire guns were formed to work block by block. Instead of relying solely on massed artillery from distant positions, commanders pushed guns into streets and squares to engage strong points at short-range Polish First Army. Operating alongside Soviet formations, used its knowledge of Polish language and local conditions to establish contact with civilians and to set up provisional administrations in newly captured towns, while its infantry battalions took part in assault operations on the coastal strip. Civilian strategies for adaptation varied according to location and available options. In areas still connected to the ports, families attempted to move westward in stages, sheltering for days in villages or small towns while waiting for space on transport. When Soviet forces approached, some residents hid in basements or farm buildings rather than joining refugee columns that were exposed on open roads. Polish and Kashubian inhabitants, who had experienced German occupation policies since 1939, often tried to identify themselves to advancing Soviet and Polish units to avoid being treated as German civilians, while at the same time coping with requisitions and the arrival of new authorities. Psychological adaptation among soldiers reflected the cumulative strain of the last year of war. German letters and reports from East Pomerania indicated a mixture of fatalism and determination, with some units continuing to fight in the expectation of eventual evacuation by sea, and others focusing on holding positions long enough for civilians to escape. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had fought from the Vistula or earlier, confronted the prospect of another high-casualty campaign shortly before the expected final offensive against Berlin. Commanders used rest rotations, awards, and political briefings to maintain morale. But diaries and memoirs later noted fatigue and a desire for the war to end. On both sides, resource management and improvisation became central to daily survival. German workshops repaired damaged tanks and guns using parts from wrecks, while supply officers rationed remaining fuel and ammunition. Soviet logistic units rebuilt rail lines behind the advance, laid temporary bridges over rivers and canals, and organized collection and repair points for damaged vehicles. Medical services adapted by establishing temporary hospitals in schools, factories, and large houses, often close to the front to reduce evacuation times. Local resistance and underground movements played a limited but notable role. In some districts, Polish activists emerged from clandestine networks to provide information on German positions and to help identify collaborators, while avoiding open combat that might bring reprisals against civilians. In other places, especially in overwhelmingly German communities, the main form of resistance was passive, slowing evacuation orders, hiding conscription-age men, or ignoring instructions to join Volkssturm units. These varied forms of adaptation and resistance, by soldiers and civilians alike, shaped how the campaign unfolded on the ground, influencing the speed of Soviet advances and the duration of German strongpoints, even as the overall balance of forces pointed toward eventual Soviet control of the region. The turning point of the East Pomeranian offensive emerged in the second half of March 1945, when the remaining German strongholds on the Baltic coast lost their last land connections and the ports that had sustained resistance were captured or rendered unusable. Militarily, this shift did not come from a single assault, but from a series of converging developments: the fall of fortress cities, the exhaustion of mobile reserves, and high-level decisions that redefined priorities on both sides. One decisive moment came with the isolation and capture of Kolberg. Its fall in mid-March removed a key node in the coastal defence system and demonstrated that even heavily reinforced port garrisons could not hold indefinitely once cut off from the hinterland. After Kolberg's capitulation, German planners could no longer realistically hope to maintain a continuous coastal corridor between East Pomerania and the lower Oder Sea. Evacuation continued from more easterly ports, but the land bridge that had been used for weeks to move troops and refugees under protection of local counterattacks now began to fragment into separate pockets. At the same time, Soviet formations tightened the encirclement of Danzig and Gdynia. By concentrating several rifle armies and tank corps on the approaches to these ports, Rokossovsky forced German Second Army to commit its remaining reserves to local defence rather than to any broader manoeuvre. Attacks from the south and east gradually reduced the bridgehead, capturing suburbs and outlying villages that had served as staging areas for evacuations. Once Soviet troops reached the coast west of Gdynia and north of Danzig, both cities were effectively besieged from land, with their only link to the rest of Germany running across a Baltic Sea, increasingly threatened by air and naval attacks. German command decisions during this period reflected a recognition that the original objectives in East Pomerania could no longer be achieved. Orders prioritized holding Danzig and Gdynia long enough to evacuate as many civilians and wounded as possible, rather than attempting to re-establish a stable front. This shift turned remaining organized resistance into a delaying action, measured in days rather than weeks. The replacement of Himmler by Heinrici at Army Group Vistula and the authority given to von Sauken to conduct withdrawals within the shrinking bridgehead indicated a practical acceptance that East Pomerania would be lost. For the Soviet side, the turning point was signalled by Stavka's growing readiness to redirect forces away from Pomerania once the main objectives were secured. As Soviet troops entered Gdynia in late March and pushed into Danzig's inner districts, High Command planning began to focus again on Berlin's staff work for the final offensive accelerated, with orders prepared to transfer tank and artillery formations from 2nd Belarusian Front to sectors facing the German capital. The East Pomeranian operation was still ongoing, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The principal German forces were confined to collapsing coastal pockets, and the northern flank of the Berlin Axis was effectively secured. The civilian experience also reflected this turning point. In the weeks leading up to the fall of Danzig and Gdynia, the volume of evacuations by sea reached its maximum, then rapidly declined as harbour facilities were damaged and Soviet artillery came within range of quays and anchorages. Ships that had once departed under escort now faced increased risk from mines, submarines, and air attacks. When Soviet troops entered the ports, tens of thousands of people who had not been evacuated found themselves under new authorities within hours, with the previous possibility of escape suddenly closed. Morale patterns shifted accordingly. German soldiers in Danzig, Gdynia, and remaining coastal positions wrote of fighting to cover the last ships or to avoid capture for as long as possible, rather than in expectation of a stabilized front. Soviet units, seeing the collapse of organized resistance in one fortified zone after another, began to view the campaign as approaching completion. Casualties on both sides continued, particularly in the final street battles and in the last air and naval engagements off the coast, but the broader direction of events was clear. East Pomerania was transitioning from an active combat theatre into an occupied zone, and the operational focus of the Eastern Front was shifting toward the preparations for the Berlin offensive that would begin in April. By early April 1945, organised combat operations in East Pomerania had largely ended. The last German positions on the Hel Peninsula and in scattered coastal pockets, either evacuated by sea or capitulated as ammunition and supplies ran out units that had once formed Second Army, and parts of Army Group Vistula ceased to exist as coherent formations. Some elements reached western Baltic ports such as Swinemünde, Kiel or Denmark, and were incorporated into new defensive groupings. Others surrendered in place, or were captured in small groups as they tried to move west on their own. For many officers and soldiers, the end of the campaign meant transition from combat to captivity, with long columns of prisoners marched to collection points and improvised camps. Soviet forces were left in control of a devastated region. Towns such as Kolberg, Stolp, and large parts of Danzig and Gdynia had suffered extensive damage from artillery, bombing, and street fighting. Rail yards, bridges, and port installations lay wrecked or heavily damaged. Road networks were congested with abandoned vehicles, destroyed equipment, and unburied dead engineering units and local labour detachments. Began the task of clearing routes, marking minefields, and restoring basic communications to support the continued advance of frontline formations and the establishment of rear area administration. For civilians, the aftermath combined relief that active fighting had ended with acute humanitarian crises. In many localities, food stocks, medical supplies, and fuel were nearly exhausted. Housing shortages were severe in urban areas where entire districts had been destroyed. German civilians who had remained or been unable to embark during the evacuations now faced occupation by Soviet troops and, increasingly, the arrival of Polish military and civil authorities. Polish and Kashubian inhabitants, who had lived under German rule since 1939, emerged from forced labour, imprisonment, or concealment to assert claims to property and local office, while also confronting the same shortages and security problems. Incidents of violence, looting, and sexual assaults occurred in the confused first weeks of occupation, affecting German civilians in particular, but also other groups caught in the transition. Some Soviet commanders issued orders aimed at restoring discipline and protecting key economic assets, while Polish units and emerging police forces tried to establish regular patrols and courts. The degree to which such measures were effective varied by locality and over time. In the immediate aftermath, the contrast between the formal end of combat and the continuing insecurity on the ground was marked. Administratively, East Pomerania began to be reorganized in line with emerging post-war border decisions. Soviet military authorities recognized Polish claims to much of the territory, and Polish provisional administrations moved into cities and towns. As front lines shifted, West German officials were removed or interned. Schools and courts were reconstituted under Polish control, and Polish language signage and institutions reappeared or were created anew. This process coexisted with the presence of large numbers of German civilians who for the moment remained in place, as well as with displaced persons from other regions. For the Red Army, The conclusion of the operation meant redeployment rather than rest. Formations of Second Belarusian Front that had taken part in the heavy fighting around Kolberg, Danzig and Gdynia now received orders to shift toward the lower Oder and the northern sector of the future Berlin Front Tank Corps, and artillery formations were refitted using captured German equipment where possible and new supplies from the rear. Medical services faced the dual task of treating the wounded from East Pomerania and preparing to support the upcoming Berlin offensive. The high casualty figures incurred during the 6 weeks of fighting added to the cumulative losses of previous campaigns, affecting unit strength and the composition of assault formations planned for April. German military planning after the loss of East Pomerania focused on the defense of the Oder Line and the remaining Baltic ports further west. Ships that had once taken part in Operation Hannibal from Danzig and Gdynia now operated from ports such as Swinemünde and Copenhagen, continuing to carry refugees and troops under increasingly difficult conditions. The fall of East Pomerania meant that these ports were more exposed to air attack and that remaining overland routes were shorter and more congested. Strategically, the Reich had lost another coastal province, and the northern flank of any defence of Berlin lacked the depth and alternate supply lines that Pomerania had provided. In the broader European context, the end of major fighting in East Pomerania coincided with other late-war developments. Western Allied forces were crossing the Rhine and advancing into Western Germany. Soviet fronts further south were pushing into Silesia and Austria. News of the East Pomeranian fighting appeared in communiqué, but competed with reports from the Rhine, from Vienna, and later from Berlin itself. For local populations, however, the aftermath of the offensive defined their immediate reality. Ruined towns, crowded makeshift shelters, a mixture of Soviet and Polish authorities, and an uncertain future in a region whose political status and demographic composition were undergoing rapid transformation. In the decades after 1945, the East Pomeranian offensive occupied an ambiguous place in public memory and historiography. Militarily, it was a large-scale operation involving several fronts, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, major armoured formations, and intense urban fighting in ports such as Kolberg, Danzig, and Gdynia. Soviet archival summaries compiled after the war indicate total casualties for the formations engaged in East Pomerania on the order of 200,000, with more than 50,000 killed or missing. Some Western and Russian authors using narrower definitions cite figures above 150,000 for Soviet, irrecoverable and sanitary losses over roughly 6 weeks. German military and civilian losses, including those incurred during land battles and maritime evacuations, are harder to quantify but similarly numbered in the tens of thousands. Yet despite this scale, the campaign remained overshadowed by later events. One reason lies in the structure of victory narratives. In the Soviet Union, official histories and commemorations focused on symbolic milestones. The lifting of the Leningrad siege, the battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and the fall of Berlin. Late war operations such as East Prussia, Silesia, and East Pomerania were integrated into longer accounts, but seldom presented as separate turning points. The East Pomeranian offensive was framed primarily as a preparatory measure that secured the northern flank for the Berlin operation and opened access to the Baltic for Poland. Its high casualty cost received limited attention in public commemorations, which emphasized the final victory rather than the intermediate campaigns that made it possible. In the Federal Republic of Germany and later unified Germany, memory of Pomerania was shaped more by the experience of flight, expulsion, and maritime evacuation than by the battlefield events themselves. Organizations representing expellees from East Prussia, West Prussia, and Pomerania highlighted the fate of civilians on refugee routes and ships, the loss of homes, and the redrawing of borders. Military operations were often treated as the background to these themes. For many former soldiers and civilians, East Pomerania was one episode in a broader collapse of the Eastern Front, and their recollections blended experiences from multiple regions and time periods. Western Allied historiography contributed to the relative neglect of the campaign. English-language narratives of the war in Europe typically devote most space to operations involving British and American forces, or to Eastern Front battles seen as turning points in 1941 to 1943. When late-war Soviet offensives are covered, they are often summarized, with more detailed analysis reserved for the Vistula-Oder advance, and the Berlin Operation East Pomerania appears as a flank clearing action, important in operational terms, but not central to the overall storyline. Specialist studies of the Eastern Front and of refugee movements have examined the region in more depth, but these works reach narrower audiences. Politically, the post-war settlement reinforced these patterns. The incorporation of East Pomerania into Poland and the displacement of much of its pre-war German population meant that local continuity was broken. New Polish communities developed their own commemorative practices, emphasizing liberation from German occupation, the establishment of access to the sea, and the reconstruction of Gdansk and Gdynia interest in the detailed military history of the 1945 campaign varied by period and was often secondary to more immediate concerns about reconstruction, border security, and the integration of territories known as the recovered lands. From an analytical perspective, the East Pomeranian offensive illustrates several broader themes of late-war operations. It shows how high-level strategic priorities, such as securing flanks before a final assault and shaping post-war borders, could generate large campaigns with significant casualties, even when the outcome of the war was already decided. It highlights the interaction between land offensives and maritime evacuations, and the way in which ports and coastal corridors could function simultaneously as military objectives and humanitarian exit routes. It also underscores the cumulative strain on forces that had already fought through multiple campaigns and the impact of terrain and weather on operational tempo, despite numerical and material advantages. Debates among historians continue over questions such as whether clearing Pomerania before attacking Berlin was the most efficient use of resources, or whether the operation prolonged the war without altering its end result. Some analyses emphasize the operational necessity of eliminating the German grouping on the northern flank and securing bases on the Baltic. Others argue that the timing could have been adjusted to reduce casualties. These discussions draw on front-level reports, casualty statistics, and planning documents, but they are conducted with the benefit of hindsight that was not available to commanders in early 1945. For the people who lived through it, the legacy of the East Pomeranian offensive is recorded less in strategic assessments than in local landscapes and family histories, cemeteries, memorials, rebuilt cities, and accounts of flight, capture, or return. The campaign demonstrates how a large and costly operation can be both essential in military terms and relatively marginal in public memory when overshadowed by more symbolic events. Its study helps to complete the picture of the war's final months, connecting the better-known drive on Berlin with the complex and violent processes that unfolded along the Baltic coast in the weeks immediately before the war in Europe ended.